Hi, it's Arjun. Our Super Spike post last week asked the question, does the US president's party matter for long-term energy macro results? And our conclusion was, in looking back at all the administrations since 1992, is that you could not find a discernible trend between share price performance, crude oil production, LNG production or exports, even US or global CO2 emissions, depending on which party was in power. The political rhetoric barks, so to speak, but does not bite. Now, the notable exception are individual projects or companies. If you're a Democratic administration and perhaps you didn't allow some oil or gas pipeline to go forward, that could have impacted some company or subset of companies. Conversely, if a future Republican administration were to somehow withdraw some of the subsidies in the IRA favoring specific new energy technologies, I can imagine how some of those companies might be specifically impacted. But the broader energy macro, despite all the heated rhetoric you see out there, the long-term trends are what matter, which means commodity macro, cost of supply, geopolitics, capital spending cycles, all the mega trends is what drives energy. And so in the spirit of peace, love, and unity, which we're going to try and do a much better job of in this video than we did in the United Nations video, despite what is going to be a barrage of extremist rhetoric from both parties and the media parodying those talking points, let's focus on where there should be or can be or is areas for common ground on energy policy choices, and that's going to be the focus of this week's video. So let's start with some common ground that I think is true for presidents of both parties. Whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat, the truth is revealed in their actions, that when oil or natural gas or really gasoline prices spike, all you hear about is how can we make them affordable again? There's a huge reaction function to when gasoline prices in the US in particular start spiking. And whether you're a Republican or Democrat, that becomes the sole focus of what the administration tries to address. So in times of calmness, you'll hear Republican administrations talk more about geopolitical security, America's standing in the world, and these kind of things. And you'll hear Democrats talk more about environmental considerations. That's when they talk most loudly about taking on the, quote, fossil fuel industry, the urgent climate crisis, and such things. But as soon as we have spiking gasoline prices, all that gets thrown out the window, and it's all about bringing prices down. We saw that with the Biden administration, which on the campaign trail in 2020 talked about ending fossil fuels, but at a point when Russia invades Ukraine and gasoline spiking to $4 a gallon, suddenly it's, hey, we need companies to drill. And you see similar type effects on the Republican side, again, anytime you see spiking prices. And so the question is, how do you recognize, A, that this is a hierarchy of needs? It's one of our points when we talk about the developing world in terms of how they think about energy. It's also true for US presidents. They care about affordability and reliability, then geopolitical security, and then environmental considerations. Ultimately, we're going to want to take all three of those areas into account, but it's absolutely a hierarchy of needs, not just for the developing world, but also for the president and their party that's in power. I want to talk about the US as an energy superpower. And again, huge kudos to my friend and colleague, Paul DeBar, for the thought process around this. You hear Republicans talk about emphasizing oil and gas and ensuring we're a dominant producer. You'll hear Democrats talk about new energies and how can we ensure the future technologies are something we're leadership in. How or why would either party want to be choosing between these two alternatives? We should want to be an energy superpower in all of these areas. We already are in oil and gas. What can we do? What do we need to do to ensure we remain so going forward? It's been the miraculous change of the last decade that we've gone from being a big importer to, on the margin, a net exporter and really the largest producer of oil and the largest LNG exporter in the world. A dramatic change for the positive. How can we nurture that? On the other hand, the world is going to want to use a whole bunch of new energy technologies, and we should be just as motivated, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, or independents, to ensuring that outcome also happens, that we are not dependent on China for a whole bunch of new energy technologies, whether it's critical minerals, processing or refining, or actual end products or anything in between. And what are we doing? The debate should be about how we motivate new energies. Do we do it through government regulation and picking winners, or do it through motivating technology and incentives? That to me is a normal Republican versus Democrat debate, but we should want to do it all. Certainly if you're a Democrat, it can't be that we wouldn't want to be the major dominant oil and gas producer for the foreseeable future. And even for those of you that believe or want to believe that oil or gas demand is going to decline. This idea that you would cede that positioning to, say, Saudi in the Middle East on oil, what evidence is there that that's true? We have seen 90% of net global oil supply growth come from shale. It's not necessarily the lowest cost producer, but it's a place where we talked about this 2 weeks ago, where you can have the types of investments, capital markets, technology, and competition to get that oil out of the ground. Yes, some of the original Saudi oil fields are low cost in nature, but they've never been on the hook. They've never actually tried to grow supply to meet demand growth. Over the course of my 30-year career, you look at OPEC production, it's actually barely up over a 30-year period. And so the idea that we would want to cede, quote, the last barrel produced to other countries, that position needs a major rethink when you talk about Democrats. When we talk about Republicans, there's a lot of mocking and making fun of, wind farms and solar and all the challenges of intermittency. These are going to be critical technologies that the world is already using and is going to want to use going forward. The idea that somehow we would want to cede that leadership to other parts of the world, I'm going to push just as hard back on Republicans as they push back on the rhetorical position that Democrats take towards oil and gas. I think whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, huge motivation to care about jobs. The idea that we would only care about oil and gas jobs, or that we would only care about, quote, green jobs, and I would note, there is no such thing as a green job. There are jobs in both traditional energy and new energy, and why wouldn't anyone want it all? If you're a Democrat, the idea that there should be a just transition, which are really some of the most paternalistic words and phrasing you could have out there, and that we should somehow ensure fossil fuel workers are able to transition to the new economy, is absolute rubbish. We need fossil fuel jobs, and a lot of them we should want to ensure our industry is dominant, but we also should want new energies jobs. And again, to Republicans, how do we motivate that new energies jobs are created in this country and not in other countries around the world? I would think on the other points, Republicans and Democrats and independents should all agree that our companies are paying and will pay competitive wages and that worker safety is important. So when we import, whether it's energy or other finished goods from other countries around the world, do they meet these standards? And if they don't, why would any presidential party or politician excuse that? If energy or any finished product is made with, for example, slave labor in a place like China, or is met with substandard wages paid to workers or substandard environmental considerations, why would we excuse that? I think in the United States, we think our environmental track record is as strong as any region or country out there, perhaps along with Europe and a few other rich places. And it would make sense from a jobs perspective to ensure that we have a level playing field. Now, whether that should be done through tariffs or taxes or border adjustments, that's beyond my scope as an energy analyst. But competitive wages, worker safety, these are, I think, areas for common ground and should impact and should be the purview of both parties. When it comes to the environment, I will concur that we should be looking to have greener energy supply than hostile nations. And here I'm going to use the term green, and I think it's appropriate to do so, where when you look at the totality of environmental consideration, pollutants like NOx and SOx, caring about clean air, clean water, and biodiversity, and caring about the emissions intensity of our production or our exports, we should look to outperform other nations. And I think we can say that this is true in some cases, but maybe not in all aspects of our production, and we should look to be better. So this will be more of a critique on the Republican side, where all you hear is about, well, it's sort of an ad throw in, we care about clean air, clean water. I don't think that's good enough. I think there is an argument that there is more of a holistic approach to be taken. And how do we ensure that American energy is truly greener than that provided by other nations? I think it's largely true, but I think we have to make sure we're bulletproof on that, especially when we're talking about things like methane when it comes to natural gas and LNG exports. I think the final point I'd make, where I think there should or will be common ground, is this on this concept of dynamic competition. It's really what sets the US apart from even some of our rich country peers, as well as much of the developing world, where, especially in energy, you often have like a dominant state-owned oil company or gas company or what have you. Here we have the full pyramid of competition out there. Mega caps, which I think are critical, large companies, mid and small, and of course, a lot of the experimentation, a lot of the innovation comes in those smaller companies. It can come with some of the larger ones. They're usually better at late stage development and really commercializing large scale developments. Shale would not have happened if we had not had hundreds, if not thousands of E&P companies believing they could get rich, the landowners believing they could get rich, and ultimately that business emerging from literally nothing a decade ago to now us being the largest oil and gas producer and exporter in the world, producer of oil, exporter of LNG. And we have a big M&A trend going on. None of this is anti-M&A. I think that's part of becoming a dominant company. But where's the new company creation? We've seen it to some degree on the new energy side. I think we need to ensure we have new company creation in oil and gas. But whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, this concept of dynamic competition and having the full period of companies be viable, let's not have a regulatory state where only big companies can kind of do the paperwork and survive it. We are going to need a whole bunch of smaller companies. And by the way, in new energies, we're going to need some mega cap companies as well. We don't really have them yet. So let's go through some examples of policy choices that sort of have been taken or are being taken now. And it's going to be a little bit of a sort of a contemporary and even historic example. And then I want to get to some future choices in the final slide. But let's start with oil. And the example of how politicians, in both parties, frankly, treat the issue of oil from Canada versus oil from Venezuela and Iran. Now, the latter two, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, get lumped into that geopolitical bucket, and we're either going to be tough on those countries or on the margin be less tough. And you have a lot of back and forth on that. But of course, as soon as our gasoline prices spike, whether you're an R or a D, you'll often see the pressure taken off and more oil coming out of those countries when our gasoline prices are high. That really can't make sense from a geopolitical standpoint. When we talk about Canada, when we hear Democrats talk about Canada, and it gets very much skewed by the environmental overlay, the talk is always, we don't need dirty Canadian oil sands. And I think there's no part of that statement that is actually true or makes sense. I will say that Canada has as tough, if not tougher, environmental, labor, and other standards that we do as a country, perhaps even more stringent in many cases. And when you look at the totality of Canadian oil barrels, they are very competitive from an overall cost of supply perspective, as well as on these labor and environmental considerations. And I do not understand why Canada is not thought about through that geopolitical lens. We are safer as a country, the United States, and as Americans, we're better off having a healthy Canadian oil industry. They have a whole bunch of heavy and medium sour grades up in Canada that our refineries can better process. They obviously are a friendly adjacent neighbor, and we should be encouraging, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, and this applies more to Democrats, pipelines and other infrastructure to ensure Canada is part of our overall US plus Canada solution. And that, to me, should be an absolute part. Because the choice is otherwise, you're doing business with Venezuela, you're doing business with Iran. And you may say, no, we're not going to do that. The proof is that every time prices have spiked, you see some sort of positive production reaction function, at least the pressure of it, for more oil and to ease up on the sanctions. Canada is part of our geopolitical solution, and I don't know why it only gets thought of through this somehow anti-oil environmental lens. It does not make sense. And while I've been critiquing Democrats on this, in the case of Republicans, I find them to be silent on Canada. There may have been some talk, we're going to approve Keystone XL or what have you, but you don't hear Canada talked about as part of the solution to having American energy security and so all the focus on American oil and gas. Canada is absolutely part of our strategic solution on a geopolitical standpoint. And by the way, on an environmental and labor standpoint as well. It is good oil that comes from Canada and gas. A second example of choices that I think we should be talking about is the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And listen, I personally have been critical of how the Biden administration used the SPR to tame high gasoline prices post-Russia, Ukraine. I didn't personally think that that was such a good use of the SPR or its intended use. We didn't actually have a supply disruption. And the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, as I think most listeners know, was created after the 70s Arab oil embargoes and the vulnerability America clearly had back then to being dependent on foreign imports. Now, a lot has changed since the 1970s, most notably in the last decade, shale. And our import dependence is much reduced. That is an absolute great thing. So it's quite possible, and I will give the Biden administration credit, may not have been for pure ideological reasons, but I think they've started a conversation on how should the SPR be reimagined. Now, how you would reimagine the SPR is not a topic of expertise for me personally, other than to me, the goal of displacing Saudi spare capacity as sort of the dominant driver of sort of flexibility in the system, I think is a goal worth understanding. Why should it be that either President Biden or previously President Trump or previously President Obama or previously W. Bush, et cetera, had to at some point go to Saudi and ask for more oil? That can't make sense. It's not a function of picking on Saudi. It's a function of having destiny in your own hands. And so if you're the US, how do we reimagine the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to be a counterbalance? A lot of change are going to have to happen. I might even suggest some notion of an expert panel or a group to do this. In this case, people who know more about this topic, folks like my friend Bob McNally, Jason Bordoff of Columbia. You have people like Dan Yergin, Megan O'Sullivan. You could come up with an excellent list who I think could do a lot of good work on how should the SPR be reimagined. This shouldn't be an R versus D kind of thing. It should be in America's interests. So let me turn to natural gas as the next topic area. And I think there has been no more upsetting of a decision than the LNG pause that the Biden administration put into place earlier this year. And I understand the talking point from moderate Democrats that, hey, there are probably too many LNG projects on the drawing board. The LNG pause, therefore, is more politics and rhetoric and not substantive. A lot of those projects weren't going to move forward. We already do have a lot of projects that have already gained approval that are in the queue, and therefore it's kind of not relevant. I'd just say I don't find those talking points to either be compelling or representative of what is, good governance or good policy around how we talk about energy. First, you've started the process of politicizing LNG exports. This started under President Obama. And it continued under Trump and it's continued under Biden, that we've gone from essentially zero LNG exports to now surpassing Qatar and Australia. That is a great thing. It was obviously a great thing when Russia unexpectedly cut off gas after the invasion of Ukraine, and it directly helped our biggest ally, Europe, to their benefit. This idea that we're now going to start playing politics in an election year with LNG exports, you could say, oh, I've done the work. There are too many projects. Who's done the work? I mean, seriously, in 2015, was there an expert out there who said within 10 years, we are going to be the #1 LNG exporter? Let the market determine whether all these projects should move forward or not. That's point number one. Number two, please do not start politicizing LNG exports. It's a really, really bad idea. But most importantly, why would we want to cede ground to Russia on this? Why are we going to let Russia try and strike new deals with China and others? And you could say this pause is not going to impact that. We still have a lot of projects going forward. That's not the point. How do we create a sense that US LNG is going to be overwhelming and that we have significant low-cost gas and that this is going to be a future energy source for the world and that you can count on the LNG to not have politicized this very important area? I really think it's one of the most disappointing aspects of rhetorical bark, where it's probably not going to actually bite in the sense that, again, a lot of the projects impacted by the pause probably realistically weren't going to go forward. But I think it really sets us back on how we talk about LNG, and it should be an unambiguous role that it's been a great thing for the rest of the world. And let's get back. Let markets decide whether we have too many or not enough LNG exports. I will say on the one point, the LNG industry in the US is not bulletproof on methane. It's a reasonable critique, and I think it does have to get there. I already mentioned that earlier in this video. The final point in terms of current choices is, and I've spent a lot of time talking about the other 7, soon to be 9 billion people on Earth, but a big chunk of that is in Asia. It's the 1.4 billion people in China, the 1.4 in India, and the 1.3, soon to be 1.4 billion people in all the other countries of Southeast Asia. And those chunks, that 4.2 billion chunk of humanity, they are the future of energy demand over the next 20, 30, probably 50 years as they move up that economic and therefore energy S-curve. And as America, for our companies and our industry, how is it not that we should be helping them meet all of the above energy demand? They're going to need oil, they're going to need LNG, but they're also going to want to need a bunch of new stuff. And again, for people on the right who say, we don't need to do all this new energy stuff, let's just focus on LNG export. If you're China, if you're India, if you're these other Southeast Asian countries, you have a whole bunch of domestic coal that is a heck of a lot cheaper than LNG. How do we counterbalance that with our technologies that can help complement what they're otherwise going to do on the power side. If they do not have a lot of domestic oil supply, they're going to try their hardest to do electric vehicles and all sorts of alternatives to oil-based transportation fuels. We should be motivating our companies and our industries to get after those markets. And we can debate how you go about doing that. Again, from a Republican standpoint, we need as strong of a new energies industry as we do on the oil and gas side. Again, for Democrats, I don't know why we'd want to cede our oil and gas industry to other parts of the world. All of the above is unquestionably how Asia is going to go about it. You may like that, you may not like that, or you may not care. It does not matter. They're going to do what is in their interest, and it's going to be all of the above. So the last area I want to get into are some major future choices on energy policy that I think is going to face administration that is going to come into power with this next election and the next few after that. I think the first is the Arctic. And this has often become a very sensitive topic for some reason. Unquestionably, the Arctic is warming. I don't think that's in dispute. And unquestionably, there is significant energy resources, oil and gas specifically, but especially oil, that exist in the Arctic. And the third point that I find very perplexing, and is the point of this bullet, is how can it be that the US, Canada, and Norway, three friendly countries, have placed the Arctic essentially off limits or are trying to put it off limits? And I contrast that with Russia, which almost without doubt, if their companies are capable, if they have the capital and they have the technology, is going to go after their share of the Arctic. So you could say there's always time to think about this differently, but I think we have to be really, really careful about claiming, especially again, I think in this case, if you're a Democrat, placing these areas off limits amongst the allied countries. Should things be done in an environmentally responsible manner? Of course. With American labor, or in this case, Canadian or Norwegian labor, of course. But the Arctic is part of future energy supply, and that it may not matter for the next 10 or 15 years because we still have a bunch of shale and we have deep water Brazil and some Canada growth. But over the long run, maybe 20, 30, 50 years, this is going to be a really important area of future supply. And I would be very concerned if the three allied countries, US, Canada, and Norway, decide that it's off limits for our companies, but then Russia is able to go after it with their companies. That can't make sense from a policy standpoint, and it deserves discussion. I think a second topic area, and this probably applies more to the Republican side of the aisle, is EV manufacturing and ensuring that the US is competitive with, I think, Mexico and China, and probably worst of all, Chinese companies in Mexico exporting to America. And so of all the new energy technologies, I don't like that in some cases people are trying to force EVs onto consumers and having these 100% mandates. On the other hand, of all the new technologies out there, with the possible exception of solar being the other one, this is one of the areas that is scaling up. And I know there's a tax credit for consumers to get a bit of a discount on the purchase price of a car, but by and large, EV economics, some companies are losing money. Tesla's made money. It's kind of all over the board, as you'd expect with any industry. But I'm going to call it a real industry that is not overly dependent on subsidies, as are some of the other areas. Hydrogen comes to mind, is totally dependent on subsidies. This is not. I think this is one of consumer choice. And I think consumers are going to some large segment of consumers are going to like driving electric vehicles. We know that. I'm an example of that. I do not drive an EV because I'm concerned about my personal carbon emissions. I think it's a ludicrous thing for an individual to be concerned about. I will say that I drive it because I actually like driving it. I like charging at home. I like the one pedal driving. I drive 1.5 miles to our local golf course, and that's it. So I have no range anxiety going 1.5 miles and when I can charge at home. Not the situation for everybody, which is why I don't believe forcing this. But if you're a president, if you're a Republican president or a Democrat president, how do we ensure that EV manufacturing happens with American jobs, American workers in our country, and that we do not get undercut by cheap labor or subsidized labor or insufficient environmentally protected labor or worker conditions in these other countries? I think it's a topic of focus. I'd also say, and again, this probably also applies maybe a little bit more to pushing back on Republican talking points, is we should care that future new energy technologies are housed in America, whether that's batteries, solar, wind, nuclear. Energy efficiency is a huge thing. Why would we diminish efficiency standards? You can debate when we're forcing a new technology that's not ready for prime time. That deserves debate. If you're going to force EVs too quickly in the name of efficiency, I don't support that. But how do you start arguing not picking winners versus picking winners? how much tax incentives we have versus how much forced regulation we have. How do we make that more the debate? I'm personally not a huge fan of the IRA, but it's not entirely without merit. And I think reforming it, going away from picking winners, going away from massive subsidies would be a step in the right direction. On the other hand, the notion of incentivizing companies, that aspect of it, I think makes sense. And so how do you take the best parts of the IRA, which is trying to motivate technology development in the US, but ensure we're technology agnostic and that we let markets develop under their natural time horizons as opposed to artificial time horizons? All these types of issues, I think, should apply to both parties. You currently hear Democrats talk more about this, to their credit. And I think a critique of Republicans, maybe with the exception of nuclear, is to ensure that they also care and figure out the right way to care about all these new industries that I think are going to drive a huge portion of energy sourcing in the decades ahead. It is not just going to be oil and gas. While I think oil and gas demand grows for the foreseeable future, demand for all this other stuff is going to grow even faster, and we should want our companies to be part of that. So I'll end this video on a personal note. I think it was 2 Sundays ago, I had the great fun and joy to go with my son and some of his buddies to go see Dark Star Orchestra, which is, for those of you that don't know, a Grateful Dead cover band. Now, I know I've spent a lot of time talking about my love for metal and all my top 10 heavy metal concerts I've been to early in my life as a high schooler and college person to now later in life. But my musical taste, I don't talk about it too much, they actually did expand a little bit post-college. Grateful Dead, one of the areas I like, and then sort of classic country, the Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, Hank 2, Hank 3, David Allan Coe's of the world, I'm also actually a decently large fan of. I say this about the Grateful Dead. There are probably technically more accomplished and capable guitarists than Jerry Garcia was, but it is the uniqueness of this sound of this band that it really makes them, I think, a remarkable band. That first of all, this concert was in Asbury Park at the Stone Pony. Awesome place to see a show. I'm a huge fan of the Jersey Shore. If I could go to beaches anywhere in the world, it would actually be the Jersey Shore. And this venue is right off the boardwalk in Asbury Park. A really fun place to see a concert. But these guys, this Dark Star Orchestra, which I've actually not heard of, I guess they've actually been around for 25 years. Awesome cover. They played a set list from, it was Dick's Picks Volume 5, which is a really good show, actually from New Jersey, I think in the early 70s. And we had a great time. The age group was 15 to 75. So this is a band that really reached its heyday was probably the 70s and 80s. Its peak was probably the 80s. Yet there was a younger generation that was totally into it, including my son and some of his friends. So just wanted to highlight, it's summer. You should go out and see some concerts. We've got another month left. And Dark Star Orchestra, I'd put them on my to-see list. Thank you.